James Earley comes from a family that is steeped in Dublin's art history and, in some ways, in the commercial history of the city, because at one point, Earley Studios was the single largest employer within the stained glass industry here. And if you live in Dublin, as most but not all listeners do, you're probably passing by James Earley's work all the time. At Bloom's Hotel, he brought the central characters of Ulysses to life. It is one of the largest murals of its kind on the island of Ireland, if not the largest. And I love it. And as much as it's a fundamentally, it's a tribute to the literary world of Joyce and the characters of the 16th of June, 1904, I look at it and I think it's also a homage of sorts to the age of Art Nouveau. And I've always kind of felt looking at it that it's a nod to Early's own heritage. Because when I look at how he's framed all of those characters from Stephen Dedalus to Molly Bloom, I kind of see in those panels windows, a nod back towards stained glass. But if it's possible to take stained glass visuals and apply it to the world of painting, James Earley has definitely managed to do that. As part of the Dublin City Council Dublin Winter Lights, Earley has produced a beautiful piece of art on Dublin's Custom House. And it's perhaps typical of his own attention to detail that this piece has taken time, a lot of time. James Earley doesn't work quickly. He thinks, do it right. And it's taken enough time that had it all gone well, it actually would have happened last year and would have been in the programme then. But for the artist, I think time is key. And the piece is influenced again by the heritage of the beautiful art form of stained glass. It's a real challenge to try and paint a mural that evokes the feeling of a work of stained glass, but to do it through a light show onto the canvas of a building is really extraordinary. A trick I learned from a friend, an architect, while I was giving public tours was, she said, step back a bit. There was a time that if I was talking about the Custom House, I'd be standing right there underneath it. But I learned that the best way to see any building and to appreciate it is to step back. And so from across the river and just outside Tara Street, Dart Station, that's what we did. On the south side, directly opposite the building, with the Loop Line Bridge rumbling nearby, enemy of the podcaster, we looked at the building in all its glory and we talked about this contribution. The last time we discussed the Custom House in this podcast, we're talking about it burning down in the closing stages of the War of Independence. And it was targeted, of course, not only for functional reasons. It was the head of the local government board, the day-to-day running of Ireland, came through the Custom House. But I think it was also targeted as a visual spectacular because of what the building is. And I would maintain that no building in this town matches Gandon's vision for the Custom House. And while it was very divisive in its heyday because it shifted the axis of Dublin eastwards, it's become one of the city's most iconic set pieces of architecture. And Early talks about some of its decorative features and how they inspired his work. For example, the riverheads that we'll get into later on. I'm always happy to work with Dublin City Council, the Dublin Winter Lights, because like the Festival of History that I programme with the council, it's something I feel is fundamentally democratic, which is important to me. It's largely free, it brings art into the public sphere, and it's not the Christmas lights. That's a different thing entirely. See Nullagonna blazing brightly over the heads of shoppers on Henry Street for that. We've had Christmas lights in Dublin for decades, and we will for generations more. But this is a light show that brings international artists to the city and taps into the deep reservoir of local talent as well. And shows like that, they're famous in cities like Berlin. They bring people to see these annual light shows. I think this one in Dublin is really growing into something quite brilliant. Early's involvement to me is particularly important because few artists are as conscious of light itself, how it interacts with art, how it can transform something in an instant, as someone steeped in the stained glass tradition. So on a cold Christmas Day on the Southside Quays, we gazed across the river at a different century and how a very modern form of art interacts with the past. In a sense, this whole thing is a collaboration. James Gandon and James Earley. I hope you enjoy it. This is the first of two editions spotlighting interesting new additions to the Dublin City Council Dublin Winter Lights. On Camden Street, a stained glass window gives a clue to the former life of one of Dublin's largest public houses. Not alone did Earley Studios employ the greatest number of staff, as I mentioned, it was the longest established firm in the business of stained glass. It was present in the life of this city for over a century. I won't ruin the surprise of what pub now occupies the home of Earley Studios. I'll let James position the business for you.
Yeah, it's Early Studios based on number 1 Camden Street, and which is now it's a Weatherspoons establishment, sadly. But to give them their dues, they do actually take good care of the buildings. So restoration work was great. They did inside. But Early Studios, kind of the name Early first appeared really in the 1860s there. And then officially it was Earley and Company in 1903. And then finally it closed trading, unfortunately, in 1975. But at its height, over 100 people working there, and best known for their stained glass and marble work throughout Ireland, England, and as far as Australia.
And to their credit, as James mentioned, one thing that chain does actually is they treat buildings with some architectural respect, be it a former cinema in England or a stained glass studio in Dublin's Camden Street. There are little nods to the stained glass heritage of the site right throughout it. More than windows were being produced there at one point. I mean, think about ecclesiastical art in the broadest sense, religious statues too. It was an ever busy place. A young Mr. Behan was at one point employed as a painter there, and allegedly, though I've seen it in print, and I've heard variations of the yarn from multiple people who don't know each other, which was a good sign. A party trick of sorts for the young Behan involved the shoving of a heavy wooden arm from a religious statue up his sleeve, ordering a pint in the Bleeding Horse bar across the road, and then an almighty thump when that hand landed on the counter to accept the pint. Positioning Earley Studios in the broader story of Dublin stained glass, David Carron's recent book, Dublin Stained Glass, A Guide to the Finest 20th Century Windows, is the definitive guide. Born in Birmingham, of an Irish father, the story really begins with Thomas and John Earley, but Earleys would continually expand their Camden Street premises. And I think it's important to say, for a stained glass studio to be successful, it wasn't just that they had to be good at producing stained glass, they had to be good at the commercial side of things. And Earley were very much on top of that. From the family, the most renowned stained glass artist would be William E. Earley, or Bill, as James remembers him, who developed what David Carron describes as a pleasing aesthetic featuring a palette of rose pinks, emeralds, and most of all, blue. The work of the family is still visible across city and county. And I always make the point when talking about stained glass, going back to that word I love, democratic, it is a very democratic form of art. I mean, you walk into a church for free and it's often there before you.
There's some marvel examples actually very close to Camden Street. So there's like a Whitefriar Street church. That is a beautiful, beautiful examples of my great granduncle, Bill Earley. On the left hand side, when you come into the church, there's about 4 or 5 huge, beautiful. I think some of his best windows for sure. Ringsend as well. There's St. Patrick's Ringsend Church. Amazing work again by Bill. And Clarendon Street as well, St. Teresa's there. So there's some in the centre, in the thick of it all, that are very easy to get to.
Clarendon Street, mentioned there, is unusually both one of Dublin's more hidden churches and one of its most frequented. You know it. It's down the laneway that runs from Grafton Street along the side of Bewley's. And in Carron's book, he tells us, the subject of William E. Earley's windows relate to Our Lady and prominent Carmelite saints. As with all of William E. Earley's windows, harmony of colour and composition take precedence. No space is left unadorned. Angels and putty abound to contribute to a lush, fully orchestrated effect. Such a book as David Carron's is completely invaluable, and Earley agrees.
What a tour de force for stained glass in Ireland. Need to say more about like his books, also his Instagram account, Irish Stained Glass, but his latest book specifically on stained glass in Dublin, definitely worth a look. A great entry point into just again, like the churches I just said there a second ago, there's just so many in every single borough outside of the city centre and beyond, but definitely worth checking that out. And his other books as well.
There are some emerging young artists and established artists in Dublin and Ireland more broadly working within stained glass. And actually, if you go onto Instagram, you really do get a sense of emerging talents in the field. For an industry that was historically so bound to the church, one of the great patrons of the arts in Ireland historically, and I should actually say the churches, because it's not just in Catholic churches that you find beautiful stained glass. Unsurprisingly, given the changing nature of Irish society, a lot of this work today is not going into the public sphere in churches, but is within private homes. And most of the work that's done now in the stained glass industry is restorative. It's more about preserving the past and what's been done already. But for James, it's not necessarily just about working with stained glass itself, but trying to understand the medium more broadly and how it can be incorporated into other work. It is possible to pay homage to stained glass in murals and light shows and more besides.
Yeah. Like you said, a lot of the work that's being done at the moment is restorative, and I'm trying to take the medium into new, different places. I've worked with lots of different fabricators. I've made some stained glass panels in the studio as well, but it is at the core of all of my work. And it's very much looking at the materiality of the medium, looking at how it's constructed, be it like lead, and deconstructing that and communicating themes through that. But also my background as I work a lot within the public space, do large scale murals. Originally kind of started as a graffiti artist when I was 15, 16 years old. So that idea of working to scale and working with narratives in the public space, you don't get something more accessible and approachable and long lasting like the medium of stained glass.
But before getting into the custom house, I'm obsessed with the Ulysses homage on Bloom's Hotel. The murals have been there since 2014 somehow. And I think they're holding up quite well, actually, considering how long they've been there. The project took the guts of a year to complete, and it was a very busy year in James Earley's life. I still see things in them afresh and anew. For example, when we were chatting about them, he mentioned the wedding rings in the panels showing Leopold Bloom and Molly Bloom. I'd never noticed them before. But there are other little homages to the characters, a bottle of booze with Stephen Dedalus, or the Star of David with Leopold Bloom. I remember watching him paint it day after day. It was a real joy to watch that mural slowly take form. And it's become, I think, a pilgrimage of sorts for some visitors to the city. And on Bloom's Day, you'll often see people photographing themselves at it, perhaps proving the point, well, one of the points at the core of Ulysses, I think, is that Dublin can have the feeling of a village in which people are constantly running into or from one another. The commission for the Ulysses murals came about through a chance conversation on the street.
That came to me. I was painting actually a mural down on it was in Temple Bar on the old ESB substation, working away in it, and the owner of Bloom's, Martin Keane, just really nonchalantly strolled up to me one day. Hey, you there? And he's quite. I love Martin, like a piece of Marmite kind of person. I'm a fan though. We got on well, and he just kind of said, "Here, see that hotel down there? Would you have an interest in painting that?" And I was kind of like, "Is he for real?" Or but look, like everything, I'm diligent at following things up, no matter what they are. And it's like, this seems like an amazing opportunity. So through the jigs and the reels, 2 years later, I got to paint it. And originally, Martin kind of said, "Look, I'd like this to be about an homage to Irish musicians and rock musicians, and kind of some of the rock greats that were on the outside of the Temple Bar Music Centre, as it was called at the time." And I said, "Here, look, just leave it with me. I'll come back to you in a couple of months with something a bit more fleshed out." And I looked at the name, Bloom's Hotel, and was like, look, and even their branding had like an Art Nouveau kind of style to it. And I was like, let's look at Ulysses. This is a book, obviously, that is held in extremely high regard. The prevalent art form at the time was Art Nouveau. There's something amazing that we can do to kind of weave these two things in together. So, looking at the architecture of the building, there's a couple of key large areas that are perfect for character panels. And then in between those character panels, there's the thematics of the book, the various different chapters, and albeit shown in a more of a kind of like an abstracted manner, but they're all there. And within the character panels, then there's there will be signifying objects placed within each, and they're common to certain people. So Blooms and Molly would have certain common things like the kind of their wedding rings or various other things that crop up in the book. But an exciting but equally terrifying project, because I feel like you're playing with fire. There's so many people who hold Ulysses in such high regard. I was terrified to take it on, but also excited.
And it will, of course, as all art on the street does, eventually age. It survived the enormous project at the neighbouring central bank, the former central bank building. One thing I love about it is that James has talked about being new to the subject of the book when he began it, discovering Ulysses to be, in his own words, the forever peeling onion with a million layers. But it's a mural that I just cannot imagine that part of town without now. For me, it's one of the redeeming things of the Temple Bar area.
Yeah, a lot of work and effort and toil went into it, but I'm still really proud of it. It's held the test of time extremely well.
The Custom House is a different beast entirely, of course, from a modern hotel. And it's a building that offers its own challenges. It's a busy place in the sense that buses are constantly coming and going from the front of it, and it's there alongside the river. The colour is projected from glass pieces, and last year some of the issues around this piece of art were actually global, not local. It was really, really difficult last year to get things in the post. The building and scale is so evocative, isn't it? And Buildings of Ireland, a great resource, describe it as a magnificent neoclassical essay in civic building. It's extraordinary just how much the Custom House has managed to keep its own strong presence, despite being surrounded on all sides by things like Liberty Hall, the IFSC, Busaurus. I mean, Dublin has grown and grown and grown around that building. Gandon first emerged as an architect under the stewardship of Sir William Chambers, a defining architect for 18th century London. Of course, 18th century Dublin was very much obsessed with 18th century London and emulating the first city of the British Empire. A biographer of Gandon, with a strange choice of words, hate is a big word, tells us that, like his master, he hated the Greeks, admired the Romans, and looked to the French. But Gandon first emerges under Chambers in London society, and it's in 1781 that he's brought to Dublin to bring about the Custom House on the Liffey. 1781, I mean, he was born in 1742, so he's not a particularly young man by the standards of his trade when he arrived in Dublin. The course of Gandon's life could have gone very differently. I mean, he'd been lured to St. Petersburg by the Romanov family who tried to get him there, but in the end, their loss was Dublin's gain, and having reached the age of 40, he embarked on the Custom House. So it's the Riverside Custom House that's the canvas James Earley worked with here. And it made sense to him not to projection map the project, but to take a looser approach. And you see the work now, of course, all the toing and froing and the unknowns fade into the background.
That's always the way. Like, a lot of people will see like a large scale project and kind of go, "Oh wow, it's just there." And there's many moments in it of trials and tribulations. And this was actually meant to be projected last year. So what happened actually was there was a delay with I guess like the production, the pieces, the piece of glass that are used to project the color. They were produced, but last year, as we all know, there was issues with global transport, so they didn't make it on time. So that was one. That was like I guess, albeit a minor one that nobody knows about. But the other one is actually how to best utilize the building as a structure, as the architecture of it, and the medium also, how to best use the medium. So like, this isn't projection mapped onto it. This is used with like I guess, miniature kind of like images of glass that are directly projected on, but you have less control over that. So as you kind of have to I had to allow a little bit more kind of like looseness and play with that. How different shadows would be affected as they're projected. What about overlap of certain piece of glass when they project, and the vibrancy and all of these unknowns, really, because you can design and design and plan and think that something's going to be aligning with this or that, and it can come out differently. Now, as it happened, it came out way beyond my expectations. Um, I very much lent into the symmetry of the building, but also added an asymmetric element to the design. So it just there's this kind of like a bit more of a rhythm and an off kilter balance to it that kind of excites me a bit more than having something that's perfectly symmetrical. It's just too geometric. Um, and then there's also like the main kind of focal point, I guess, pulls you back into the center of the building, um, which which just made the most sense, given its layout.
So we're essentially seeing stained glass in all its glory across the building. And a few things about the setting are really striking. The river itself becomes a part of the show because light, it might be projected onto the custom house, but the river, the mirror effect, it creates something else visually in the water. And while some artists have come to rue the river Liffey, don't mention the clock, the effect here is wonderful. For an artist who works in the medium and on the theme of stained glass and its heritage, the way glass and light interact has long been an interest for Earley. The work is driven by kind of macro photographs of handmade stained glass, so it was important to get into the production process with James. But as well as that, he mentioned things that he noticed on the building that he wanted to incorporate and pay homage to. The riverheads that appear on the custom house, for example, the work of Edward Smith. I love those riverheads. I think they're one of the great little architectural details of Dublin City we can miss as we're strolling around the place. Yeah, Smith's work on the building also included the lion and the unicorn, the royal coat of arms, largely vanished across the city now, but still present on both sides of the custom house. But as his entry in the Dictionary of Irish Biography puts it, the heads were his greatest achievement. And I quote, they are a series of 14 keystones positioned on ground floor window and portal arches of the custom house, symbolising as avenues of trade the 13 principal rivers of Ireland and the Atlantic Ocean. The idea derived from similar arch keystones on Somerset House in London. Completed in Portland stone in 1784, the sculptured heads each represented, in characterisation and ornamental detail, the economic and historic significance of the river and its basin. The only female head, representing the Liffey, was placed over the central doorway on the south facade, facing the river it signified. Now, these heads would, in time, even make their way onto our currency. They are truly iconic.
It is a medium that is very much attributable to light. It functions with light. It's organic kind of manner in how it reacts in a sculptural fashion to light as it moves around the day. It's really a marriage made in heaven for this medium that we're looking at. They're both light. It's all about color and transposing that onto this building. Which also kind of leads me into like this idea of the materiality of glass and stained glass, and a lot of people might not know. Like there's two real kind of main types of stained glass. There's handmade glass, which is blown, and it's kind of blown into a huge big cylinders, which are then stacked, and then they're sliced down their side, and then as they're put through a kind of like a kiln of sorts, the piece slowly unfurls at that weak point, and you get all kind of interesting striations, and there's all these tiny little kind of air bubbles and pockets called seeds. And with this piece, I took some macro photographs of those pieces, and within those structures, there's turbulence, and there's kind of like it's a motive crossover with the visual nature of water and movement. So very much linking in with obviously the proximity of the water to the custom house, and also with the work that Edward Smith had done as well on his the riverheads, which are representations of the various different great rivers around Ireland that are in more of kind of like a mystical format.
James is clearly passionate about the heritage of stained glass, as is his father Michael, who was interviewed by the Dublin Inquirer not long before the Camden Street Wetherspoons opened. And there was considerable talk in recent times in the city about the potential of a Harry Clarke museum. Now, I thought what was so interesting about that was the public immediately responded to that very, very favourably. I think Harry Clarke is one of those artists that just exists in the kind of collective psyche of Irish people. And I'm looking forward to talking to David Carroll on the show early next year about Harry Clarke, because anytime we come at the subject of stained glass, for example, the episode about the artist Michael Healy with David before, Clarke always seems to loom large. It always comes back to Harry. Currently, Dubliners have the chance to see 6 unusual Harry Clarke works on display in Collins Barracks, and the reason they're there, well, Cork's loss is Dublin's gain. They're a special collaboration between the National Museum and the Crawford Art Gallery, which is currently undergoing massive renovation. So 6 panels that were never previously displayed in the same place before are there to go and look at for free. I think a Harry Clarke museum is a great idea, not merely as a spotlight on Clarke, though he has the name recognition, but more broadly for what it could do for this art form, its legacy and its practice.
Yeah, definitely. I fully agree with that. Obviously, trying to be completely unbiased, but like I'm going to throw that to the wayside. Yes, definitely would be magnificent for that. And I think places like that, it might be a focal point on Harry Clarke, but usually with space like that, it opens things up for other people to get involved, and as a space maybe for talks, maybe for promoting the wider kind of ideas behind stained glass. That will happen. That will happen with a place like that.
James Earley's work exists all around the city of Dublin. A particularly beautiful piece can be found at Wilton Park, linking Mary Lavin Place and Lad Lane. It's like a glass ceiling overhead. It's a riot of colour, again evoking stained glass, not unlike the show on the Custom House. Earley talks about the nature of art in the public space, and of course, a lot of larger pieces with more permanence about them. They're often tied to development and developers. Murals, by comparison, do have the feeling of being temporary about them. But he's particularly taken by Ardú in Cork, which is a project that began in lockdown and which, like Waterford Walls, means a lot to the artistic community there. And yeah, it's the nature of a lot of this art that as a piece comes, a piece goes.
Down on the quays, actually not too far from here, down towards Windmill Lane, there's a large-scale mural there. The idea behind that piece is linked in with the musical past of Windmill Lane. I think probably a good example is the way it's run in Cork. There's some amazing work done down there with Ardú Festival, and I think they've just got it pitch perfect with that. There's enough murals out there, and they rotate the walls, and that idea of other artists maybe painting over previous artworks by other artists, I'm all for that. I wouldn't be too precious about my artwork. Yeah. The more the merrier.
So thanks so much to James Earley for joining me opposite the Custom House and getting into not only this piece of work, but the legacy of Earley Studios and his own practice more broadly. Do go and take the chance this weekend to see it in all its glory and walk around the city and see some of the other artworks that are part of this annual celebration. Thank you so much for tuning in to this edition of the Three Castles Burning podcast and for listening over the course of the year. I'm not an art historian. I'm someone that's interested in art. In particular, the last year or two, I've become more and more interested in art. And some of my favourite editions of the podcast have been around art history. So I really enjoyed the chance to talk to James Earley. And there is just something very special about talking with an artist about their work in front of it.